Under a sky the color of burnt steel, the forest held its breath. Smoke drifted low through the trees, curling around the frozen bark like a ghost reluctant to leave. The thunder of artillery had gone silent an hour ago, leaving only the crack of distant branches and the faint hum of engines retreating beyond the ridge. A squad of American soldiers moved cautiously along the dirt road, their boots pressing into a layer of frost that whispered with each step. The air carried the metallic scent of gunpowder mixed with pine. Every sound felt amplified in the quiet aftermath, every motion deliberate, as if the world itself were listening. At the bend in the road, half shrouded by fog, a figure appeared. The silhouette of a man in a long gray coat, cap still on, hands raised not in fear but in formality. His movements were controlled, his posture steady despite the tremor of exhaustion that flickered through him. The Germans froze, their rifles steadied in unison, the brief tension hanging in the air like the last note of a song. But something in the Germans' composure slowed the pulse of violence that usually followed such encounters. He was not pleading. He was not broken. He stood like a man acknowledging an ending he already understood.
The leading sergeant stepped forward, eyes narrow beneath his helmet. He gestured for the man to move closer. Frost crunched under the German's boots, slow, deliberate, measured. The two groups met in a space between commands, between ideologies, between what war expected and what humanity occasionally remembered. In that suspended moment, no one shouted, no one cursed. Breath met breath in the cold morning air, rising in faint white clouds that mingled and vanished together. And as the German officer drew near, he paused. With a motion both simple and profound, he raised his right hand in salute, not to provoke, not to deceive, but out of a habit older than hatred. For a heartbeat, the Americans did nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, the sergeant returned the gesture. Two soldiers, enemies by law, found themselves bound by something older than the uniforms they wore. The quiet recognition that dignity can survive even in ruins.
The salute hung in the air like a fragile thread between worlds. For a moment, no one moved. The forest seemed to lean in, its quiet broken only by the faint hiss of wind through frozen leaves. The German's arm remained raised, steady despite the tremor of cold. His eyes did not challenge. They waited, not for mercy, but for acknowledgement. Behind him, the wreckage of war smoldered faintly, the gray smoke curling upward as if reluctant to leave what it had claimed. The American sergeant felt the weight of that gesture settle on him like snow. It wasn't a command or a boast. It was something older, cleaner. The salute was a language both men understood, stripped of politics and propaganda. In it lived the memory of training fields, of orders shouted under the open sky, of respect taught before the world fractured into sides. The silence grew heavy, almost unbearable, until the sergeant's hand rose, slow and deliberate, to meet the German's. Their eyes met, not as conqueror and captive, but as two weary participants in a human tragedy too vast for either to define. Around them, the younger soldiers watched, uncertain, some lowering their rifles as if instinctively sensing this was not a moment for violence. The exchange lasted no longer than a breath, yet within it lay the weight of centuries, the unspoken code of warriors who, despite everything, refused to forget what honor meant.
When the German lowered his hand, he seemed smaller, not in defeat, but in peace. The sergeant nodded once, a gesture of quiet understanding. The forest exhaled,
Somewhere beyond, the war continued its relentless march. But here, in this pocket of stillness, two men had briefly reminded the world what it meant to be human. Long before it became a symbol of armies and rank, the salute was a gesture born from vulnerability, an open palm shown to prove there was no weapon, no threat. In ancient times, knights lifted the visor of their helmets to reveal their faces, a small act of trust in a world shaped by suspicion. Across cultures, the movement evolved, but the meaning remained. Acknowledgement without hostility, recognition without surrender. To salute was to say, I see you, and I come not as a shadow, but as a man.
Centuries later, the gesture became a ritual of discipline and order, codified into the strict language of military life. Yet beneath the uniform precision lay something older, something deeply human. Every lift of the hand carried echoes of civility amid chaos, a quiet promise that honor could exist even in conflict. In battlefields where men were reduced to numbers and commands, the salute stood as one of the last surviving courtesies, a remnant of a world that still believed in respect. By the time of the Second World War, this gesture had traveled through centuries of blood and ceremony. It was no longer just about obedience. It had become a fragment of shared heritage among soldiers who might never share words. When a German officer saluted an American, he wasn't defying war. He was remembering the deeper language it once obscured. And when the salute was returned, it wasn't diplomacy. It was memory of a time when even enemies could meet with open hands instead of closed fists.
In the German army, honor was a code etched into every command. It was not simply about victory, but about precision, a belief that discipline was a form of moral clarity. From the earliest drills at dawn to the formal etiquette of officers' messes, order was sacred. The salute was performed with exact angles, deliberate pace, and unspoken pride. To deviate from that ritual was to dishonor one's lineage, one's uniform, one's nation. It was a gesture tied to hierarchy, to the belief that structure itself preserved civilization from chaos. Even in defeat, that devotion to form remained, like a cathedral still standing amid ruin. For the American soldier, honor carried a different tone. It was less about lineage and more about principle, the dignity of the individual rather than the perfection of the system. The salute existed not to enforce obedience, but to express mutual respect, a private to a general to a private, both acknowledging the same shared duty. It was democracy in motion, an emblem of equality carried into the ranks of war. Where the German saw order as purity, the American saw it as balance, strength tempered by conscience.
When these two moral frameworks met on the battlefield, they clashed yet quietly admired one another. The German respected the American's restraint, the American the German's discipline. Beneath the smoke and the slogans, there was an unspoken symmetry, two ways of holding dignity against the collapse of the world. The salute between enemies did not erase their differences, it illuminated them. It showed that even when belief systems diverged, both men stood upon a common ground of respect, each bound to a code that kept them human amid the machinery of war. The German officer's name was Wilhelm Kruger, though the Americans would never know it. His face, hollow from weeks without sleep, carried the pale imprint of winter and worry. In his pocket rested a letter from his wife, folded so many times the edges had begun to fray. She wrote of their son learning to walk, of the bakery that had reopened down the street, of hope spoken in whispers between the cracks of air raids.
Wilhelm read it each night by the dull light of a dying candle, tracing the words with a gloved finger, as if touch could preserve the warmth they described. By morning, he would tuck it away again, armor against despair.
On the other side of the line, Sergeant Daniel Foster carried his own paper talisman, a note scrawled on a scrap of ration box, signed with a single word, home. His wife hadn't written much. There was no need. The meaning lived in his memory. The smell of her coffee, the way the porch groaned beneath the weight of summer rain. Each man fought for something distant but tender, something that softened the edges of duty. The nights had grown colder. Frost crept into boots and bones alike, and even courage felt brittle. Both men, in different trenches, wondered the same things: whether this would be the last dawn, whether the world would remember them as men or as uniforms. When Wilhelm marched toward capture that morning, his body moved out of habit, but his mind lingered on the image of his son's small hands reaching for balance. Daniel, when he first saw the German emerge through the haze, saw not an enemy, but another man trying to survive a story too large for either of them to control.
For years, propaganda had painted the enemy in shapes of monsters and shadows. To the German soldier, the American was portrayed as crude, lazy, without honor, a nation of excess masquerading as valor. Yet when Wilhelm Kruger saw the Americans up close, he noticed the small, ordinary things. How one soldier kept his helmet tilted back like a farmhand. How another hummed under his breath while cleaning his rifle. How their laughter sounded young, not cruel. They were not the hollow caricatures from pamphlets. They were boys who missed their homes just as he did. It unsettled him, this discovery that hatred required distance to survive. For Sergeant Foster, the picture had been equally distorted. The Germans were supposed to be fanatics, unfeeling machines wrapped in iron will. But the man he had just saluted was trembling, not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion. Foster saw in him a kind of orderliness that felt almost gentle, a careful dignity even in surrender. It made him wonder how many of these so-called enemies had questioned the same orders, dreamed of the same peace.
War, he realized, thrived on abstraction. It needed the faceless to remain righteous. But here, face to face, the illusions cracked. Both men had families who waited for letters that might never arrive. Both carried the same ache of duty and doubt. The uniforms changed the outline, but not the essence. Somewhere between them lay the truth that the enemy was often just another reflection in the smoke, shaped by fear, reshaped by recognition. And once that recognition appeared, it was impossible to unsee. The battlefield, for a brief and dangerous moment, felt too small to contain their shared humanity. History, when read without haste, reveals that even in humanity's darkest hours, decency has a way of flickering through the smoke. During the First World War, on a frozen Christmas Eve in 1914, opposing soldiers climbed out of their trenches and met in the wasteland between. They exchanged tobacco and songs, shared bread, even played a game of football on soil that, only hours before, had been soaked with blood. For one night, the war paused not by treaty, but by instinct, proof that empathy could surface even where logic forbade it. When morning came, the men returned to their trenches and resumed their orders, but something within them had shifted. They had seen the enemy's face and found it human.
3 decades later, amid the brutality of a far greater war, similar moments still emerged. Allied pilots dropped supplies over enemy lines for civilians stranded in ruined cities. German medics treated wounded prisoners with the same care as their own. Small acts, often unseen, whispered that war could destroy nations, but not entirely erase conscience. These gestures were quiet rebellions against dehumanization, reminders that not every soldier was consumed by hatred. The story of Wilhelm and Sergeant Foster was not an anomaly. It was part of this hidden lineage. Each act of respect threaded itself into a long, fragile tradition, men who remembered, even in war, that the enemy still nept to the same sky.
The code of chivalry, once spoken in the language of knights and banners, found strange endurance in the age of tanks and steel. It was no longer wrapped in poetry or shining armor, but in the quiet decisions made by men who chose restraint when cruelty would have been easier. Even as war became industrial, as machines replaced faces and strategy replaced instinct, something old persisted. The belief that how one fought mattered as much as whether one won. In letters from the front, soldiers still wrote about fairness, about sparing the wounded, about offering water to the dying. They did so not out of weakness, but because some part of them still believed that decency was a kind of strength. For German officers like Wilhelm Kruger, that chivalric thread lived in their training, the idea that an honorable soldier respected even his foe. For Americans like Foster, it took shape through moral conscience rather than lineage, through the conviction that righteousness without compassion was hollow. In both men, the echoes of an older world survived, stripped of grandeur, but not of meaning. Yet that very code was fragile. It existed in the spaces between orders, in moments when no superior was watching. One wrong glance, one burst of anger, and it could be lost entirely. Still, the fact that it endured at all, in a century built on destruction, felt miraculous. Perhaps the modern battlefield, for all its chaos, became the truest test of chivalry, not in how men conquered, but in how they chose to remain gentle amid the machinery of death. War had a sound, not just the roar of engines or the whistle of shells, but the sudden, merciless silence that followed. On certain mornings, the air itself felt broken, heavy with the residue of what could never be undone. Villages lay in ruins, their chimneys jutting like blackened bones against a clearless sky. Bodies of men and horses alike lined the ditches, frozen mid-motion, as though still running from the moment they died. And yet, amid all this brutality, small acts of grace flickered like faint lanterns refusing to die out.
An American medic knelt beside a wounded German soldier, tearing his last bandage to stop the bleeding. He didn't ask what side the man fought for, he just worked, silent and steady, his breath clouding in the cold. A German officer, captured but proud, helped carry the stretcher of a man who had once aimed a rifle at him. Somewhere on the edge of the front, a pair of soldiers, one Allied, one Axis, shared a cigarette behind the remains of a wall, saying nothing, simply breathing together. The chaos raged on, but in these fragments something invisible held. It was as if, beneath the roar of destruction, there pulsed a quiet defiance, a shared refusal to let the heart become as mechanical as the weapons that surrounded them. Even in the smoke, even in the ruin, humanity persisted, fragile, trembling, but alive. The war could crush cities, erase names and silence prayers, yet it could not quite extinguish that final flicker of grace. And sometimes it was enough to remind the living why they still fought, not for glory, not for vengeance, but to keep that thin, trembling light from going out entirely.
Respect in war became a form of rebellion. It was a small, stubborn act, invisible to headlines but monumental in meaning. When a soldier chose to treat his prisoner not as a trophy, But as a man, he defied the machinery built to erase empathy. Every salute, every shared glance, every refusal to humiliate became a whisper of defiance against the vast noise of dehumanization. It was not sentimental, it was survival of the spirit. For Wilhelm Kruger, the respect he received in capture felt like a fragment of sanity. The Americans could have mocked him, stripped him of dignity, reminded him of his nation's crimes. Instead, they offered water, a cigarette, and a nod. That nod was everything. A signal that he still existed as more than an enemy, that the line dividing them had not erased his name. For Sergeant Foster, the act of returning that salute had stayed with him, echoing longer than the gunfire. It became proof that war could not command his soul. These gestures were not grand or heroic. They happened quietly, almost secretly, beneath the canopy of orders and hatred. But in their quietness lay their power. They showed that conscience, even when cornered, still found ways to speak. When men remembered to see one another, even briefly, as human, something ancient stirred, a faith not in victory, but in endurance.
Years later, survivors would struggle to explain what kept them whole amid such darkness. Perhaps it was moments like these, small, forgotten acts of respect, that though history seldom records them, may have been the only things that kept the human soul from vanishing entirely. Night fell with a softness the war had not known in months. The prisoners were gathered in a small clearing, lit by the low orange flicker of a campfire. The wind carried the faint smell of damp earth and smoke, not of gunpowder. Wilhelm Kruger sat apart, his wrists unbound now, his cap resting beside him. He stared into the flames as though searching for something he had lost long before his capture. The firelight revealed the deep lines at the corners of his eyes, the quiet exhaustion of a man who had run out of enemies to fight. For the first time in years, no orders waited, no voices barked through the cold air. Only the rhythmic breathing of men who were no longer defined by sides. At the edge of camp, Sergeant Foster leaned against a supply truck, listening to the murmur of his comrades. The day's tension had settled into something gentler, not triumph, not even relief, but a stillness that asked for silence. He thought about the German officer's salute and the way it had felt to return it. Not pride, not pity, something else, something closer to recognition.
Across the fire, Wilhelm lifted his gaze and met Foster's eyes. No words passed between them, but in that glance lay a shared surrender, not to each other, but to peace itself. The war would move on without them, but in that quiet moment, both men had already laid down their arms. Years later, when the guns had long gone silent and Europe had rebuilt itself from dust, memories of that moment surfaced like small ripples across still water. In post-war interviews, men from both sides spoke of the salute not as a symbol of victory or surrender, but as something inexplicably human that lingered in their minds. American veterans remembered it with a kind of quiet respect, a story told over coffee or in letters to their grandchildren, how in the midst of duty they had glimpsed the humanity they were told to fight against. For many, it became a private reminder that war could command their hands, but not their hearts. On the other side of the ocean, surviving German officers recalled that gesture with a mixture of humility and wonder. Some admitted it had shaken them more than defeat itself, that an enemy could return respect when all logic said he shouldn't.
In their recollections, it became a symbol of forgiveness without words, a testament that dignity could outlast even ideology. Historians might overlook such moments, but for those who lived them, they were the quiet truths beneath the noise of history. As old men, both American and German veterans sometimes met again at memorials, on fading film reels, in the shared silence of remembrance. When they spoke of that long-ago morning, their voices softened. The salute had not changed the course of war, but it had altered the course of their hearts. In the end, that was the victory neither side had expected, the triumph of respect over ruin. In the end, history often remembers the grand strategies, the treaties, and the ruins, but it is the small gestures that keep civilization from vanishing altogether. The salute between Wilhelm Kruder and Sergeant Foster was one such gesture, a moment so brief it could have been lost to the wind, yet it carried within it the essence of what makes humanity endure. In that exchange of respect, two men chose recognition over rage, grace over instinct. They reminded the world that even when the world collapses, the structure of decency can still stand, not as a fortress, but as a fragile light against the dark.
The gesture's meaning reached beyond uniforms and nations. It was not about who was right or wrong, nor about who held the stronger position. It was about the refusal to let hatred write the final line of a man's story. That single salute whispered of the possibility that beneath the machinery of war, beneath ideology and command, there remains something untouchable, a quiet thread of moral continuity that stretches from one generation to the next. For those who witnessed it, the moment became a compass pointing toward what civilization should mean, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of respect amid it. It is in such fleeting acts, the lifting of a hand, the recognition of a shared humanity, that the true architecture of peace is built. Peace, when it finally comes, seldom arrives with fanfare. It seeps in quietly, through gestures that once seemed too small to matter. The salute shared between Wilhelm Kruger and Sergeant Foster became one such seed, planted not in soil, but in memory. Long after the last shots were fired, that simple act continued to grow in the hearts of those who remembered it. It became a story told in low voices, a reminder that the roots of reconciliation are often found in the spaces between enemies, where empathy dares to survive.
Years later, both men would fade into history's shadow, their names barely noted in official records. Yet what they carried into that frozen morning outlived them. The belief that respect can exist even when everything else has fallen apart. Their moment of shared honor spoke not to the politics of their nations, but to the endurance of the soul. The idea that peace is not declared but practiced, one gesture at a time. In every age since, soldiers, historians, and ordinary people have revisited stories like theirs, searching for proof that humanity does not lose itself entirely in war. And there, in that image, two men saluting in the smoke, they find their answer. It is not the weapons or victories that define a civilization, but the capacity to recognize decency in one another, even when taught to see only the enemy. The salute was fleeting, but its echo remains, a soft, enduring promise that as long as respect survives, peace will always have somewhere to begin.